So today on the Great Drams educational video, we're going to be discussing what a blended whiskey is, what a single malt whiskey is, and what a single cask whiskey is. Three core types of whiskey style and different production methods and different releases. And I'm going to hand over to Stephanie McLeod, the master blender for Dewar's and the malt master for Aberfeldy and the Bacardi malts range. Just give us her insight, especially on what's the difference between a blended Scotch whisky and a single malt Scotch whisky.
So a blended Scotch whisky is a blend of single malts and single grain Scotch whiskies. Now that's grain. Some people think I'm saying green, but I am saying grain. So there's two different types of whiskies that are made in Scotland, malt whisky and grain whisky. Malt whisky is made using a batch process, so a batch of malted barley makes a batch of spirit. With grain whisky, it's a continuous process. And it looks very industrial, actually.
Industrial chic.
Yeah, industrial chic, yes, of course. So, you know, it's very high columns, but what it produces is very light, fruity whisky that is just the perfect base for a blended Scotch whisky on which to put our bejeweled malt whiskies on. And some people say to me, oh, you could just stick any old grain in there, they all taste the same. But there are quite a lot of differences between different grain whiskies. You know, some of them are creamy and toffee in character. Other ones have got slight sulphury notes coming through. And, you know, some of them are very fruity in character. So they all have something different to offer the blend.
So I actually described the, so our current release, the Girvan single cask, single grain Scotch whisky that we have. It's just from the one barrel, which we'll get to in a minute. I always describe that as like drinking boozy butter, because it's got that lovely, creamy, buttery kind of texture.
Yes.
But the notes of like toffee, butterscotch, and those kind of things are just, for me, superb.
And grain whisky often does very well in bourbon.
Yes.
And also it's very interesting in Oloroso casks as well, believe it or not. Although some people think that is just a step too far. But we have got some in our inventory, which are really interesting whiskies.
We might have one as well. But,
really?
Yeah, but we're not releasing it for a while.
Yes.
But,
Coming attractions.
Indeed.
Yes, so when we're, so people often ask me, how do you harness your your inventory to make a blend? So what we do is we break our inventory down into categories. So the main category being malt and grain. And then for the malts, we break it down into fruity malts, grassy malts, grainy malts, sulphury and peaty. And so there are a number of malts within these categories. And our recipe is made up of those categories and then the individual makes within them. So we obviously have our favourite ones that we want to use, but if a particular malt isn't available on the day that we want to blend, because our blending is dictated by when our whiskey drinkers want to receive their whiskey in the market, which could be the US, Japan, wherever it might be. So what we have to do then is to find a substitute.
So that's something that's always fascinated me with the art of blending, or the kind of magical wizardry of blending. That a master distillers always seem to get a lot of the credit, but the real, for me, and I'm guessing for you, but for me, I will speak on my behalf, the real actual mastery is in the blending. Because from creating a product like the fabulous Dewar's 12, that it tastes how it tastes today, theoretically should be how it tasted last month, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Maybe there'll be subtle changes as kind of consumer flavour demands have changed as well, so they're not always going to be comparable to, say, 50 years ago.
Never varies, never.
Indeed. But at the same time, you're always invariably using different inputs to theoretically create the same product. And that's always been a fascinating point for me. And as you just explained, like with when something's not available, how would you go about then saying, right, flavor X, okay, that's not in here this time.
Yeah.
How do we then build that from other products?
So we go into that category where we have our missing malt, and we might replace it directly with another malt of that character.
Right.
But sometimes that's not always possible. So we might have maybe 2 substitutes or 3 substitutes. And the important key is that we don't just blend by the flavour profile of the individual malts. We also blend by wood profile.
Okay, cool.
So we have to have a certain percentage of bourbon, of sherry, of refill casks, of dechar, rechar casks. And so it's almost, in fact, it is very like a really complicated Rubik's Cube. So you just get one bit sorted and then, you know, the wood isn't right, so you have to go back again. And, you know, sometimes we have restrictions on the warehouses that we can go into as well, because, you know, our inventory isn't just stored on our sites, but on sites all over Scotland. So it can be very complicated and can be a real logistics conundrum.
And how do you build those blends? Like, do you, from my understanding, a limited understanding of blending, a flavour brief either comes from yourself or from the team, or the wider team, or marketeers.
Yes.
And comes in and you take that, break it down into what the answer might be for that, create a pilot blend, and then do you do several? Do you leave it for a couple of days, a couple of months? How does that work until it's final sign off, I'm signing the bottle?
Yeah, so this is when we're creating a new blend.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're a consumer-led company, so it's really the voice of the consumer that we're reacting to. And so what I do is I listen to, you know, what it is they're wanting. So generally, there's an age statement in mind. And the style of the blend is built around the Dewar's House style. And so what I sometimes do is do a blind tasting with the marketeers, so that not only I understand what they want, but also that they truly understand what they want. So I'll do things like, I'll put out competitor whiskies, I'll put out it's really good fun. I'll put out our own whiskies, and I try and do it blind as well, actually, so I get someone that's unrelated to put out. So, and we kind of score, we do a kind of hedonic score of how we rate these whiskies. And then we do the ta-da and reveal what it is. So, and I'll also include in that a brief pilot blend of what I'm thinking the whiskey should be like. And it's a really good, because obviously there's a brief that's written down. But what helps me is to have a sensory brief. So this is how we want it to the aroma of it, the flavour of it, the texture of it. So it's a really good kind of 3D picture of what the goal is in the whiskey. So I always find that works for me.
And then you just scale up by slightly bigger batches each time, and then eventually it's hit go and all of the casks.
And you know, it is scientific to some extent, because we're saying, right, so we want it to be, you know, a certain amount of fruity, a certain amount of peaty. But sometimes it's just like, I think that is going to go really well with that. And it's just, you know, sampling each cask, nosing them all, and sometimes just sort of, you know, taking 2 glasses and mixing them together and then seeing what works. So, you know, there is a lot of intuition that's involved in blending, which comes from experiencing it a lot. So, you know, sometimes you can just be lucky and you just hit on it right away.
Ever unlucky?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's, you know, there's been like 12 attempts, you know, it's like version 12.
Final version 6.
Yes.
I get that on presentations a lot.
So sometimes it just happens, and other times you just go through it. So you've got tons of these little sample bottles all sitting there. And sometimes you go back to maybe the first one you did and you think, actually, That was pretty good.
Yeah. And is it the same for the single malts? Because ultimately what many, if not most, consumers around the world don't realise is that single malt is also a blend, but it's a blend from one distillery.
Yes.
And it's all malted with, like malt whiskey, blended from one distillery, multiple casks, multiple ages, multiple different cask types.
Yeah.
And not many people seem to realise that. But is it the same process exactly?
It is, and actually, you know, we're talking about blended Scotch whiskies and how hard it is to blend, but actually blending single malts can sometimes be even more challenging because it tends to be a smaller batch.
Yeah.
And so if there's one cask that isn't playing ball, that's just not quite in the same rhythm as the rest of the casks.
Limited edition.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, because we want everything to come together and to mingle with each other and to blend into this one beautiful whole. And so sometimes that can be more challenging. And, you know, especially for likes of Craigellachie and Altmore, where we're looking for that wonderful natural colour, sometimes the colour just isn't as you would expect.
Yeah.
So the flavour is bang on, but then you look at the colour and you think, okay. So then we have to get maybe more sherry casks out or take some sherry casks away.
That's because they're bottled at natural colour.
Yes.
Without any addition of caramel colouring or anything.
Exactly. So, you know, all types of whiskies, you know, if you're wanting to create a consistent flavour and, you know, of the best quality that you possibly can, then you've really got to take such a lot of care over the casks that you're choosing. And so whenever we get in a new batch of sherry casks, we always nose the casks first to make sure that everything is okay, so that there's no nasty surprises at the end of it.
Yeah. And with the last kind of subsection of the whiskey category, the single cask releases, and I mean, you guys do them with some of your exceptional casks, although sometimes they're a couple of casks blended together. Yeah. But also the Aberfeldy distillery and various others. Single cask Scotch whiskey can either be grain, or malt. Yeah. There's no kind of hard and fast rule. It can be both. But it is, for me, it's a controversial way of thinking about it. But oftentimes I think of it as the purest form of a distillery's output. Yeah. Purely because that one barrel and that one moment of time captures the distillation, the period of time spent in wood, and then that bottling. And it's just that one all-encompassing, this is us.
Yeah. Or is it?
That's the question.
Yes. Yeah. Because with a single cask bottling, in my opinion, the consumer of a single cask bottling is looking for something a little bit different. So the way I imagine it is that it's Aberfeldy, for example, but one particular aspect of it is heightened. Yeah. So it's like Aberfeldy on steroids. It's, you know, so it might be a honey note.
Rockstar kind of release. Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's a bigger version of the distillery style itself. Sure. And I always like to make sure that it's drinkable at the natural strength. Yes. Because I imagine that the consumer will want to get their money's worth and drink it at strength. Yeah. So it's got to be enjoyable, either neat or with water, or however they want to drink it. So that's sort of my criteria. So interesting and drinkable.
Marvellous. Well, thank you very much for your insight on the three core styles of Scotch whisky, and I look forward to chatting you further through the tastings of them in a bit.
I can't wait.